is a hybrid format. Witnesses, both the two colleagues and the other witnesses are in person, but members have the option to appear in person or virtually. Earlier this year, Secretary Blinken said that, quote, Beijing wants to put itself in the center of global innovation and manufacturing, increase other countries' technological dependence, and then use that dependence to impose its foreign policy preference. Beijing is going to great lengths to win this contest, unquote. It's critical that the administration has the tools it needs to protect our national security. This committee has already played a key role. We've done that through export controls that restrict the flow of sensitive technology. We've done that through the screening of foreign direct investment into the U.S. to guard against adversaries accessing our technology or critical infrastructure capabilities. 4 years ago, we enacted the Export Control Reform Act, ECRA, which provided permanent statutory authority for the U.S. government to regulate U.S. exports that have commercial and defense applications. Those controls can apply to important technology like semiconductors. They can apply to the way technology is used, like military intelligence, and they can apply to who uses it, like a Chinese quantum computing company. Along with ECRA, we passed the Foreign Investment and Risk Review Modernization Act, known as FIRMA. That law strengthened and expanded the jurisdiction of CFIUS, and Cornyn especially worked on that issue that reviews foreign investments like mergers or acquisitions of U.S. businesses. We passed these bipartisan laws because we all recognize the importance of maintaining U.S. technological leadership and the need to protect that leadership. We know that threats to our national security are evolving. We know that our adversaries will use any means they can to close the gaps between our technological capabilities and theirs without much care to how legal their tactics actually are. What we don't know is to what degree U.S. investments are helping them close those gaps. U.S. investments, venture capitalists or pension funds, could wittingly or unwittingly support foreign technological investments that, in the words of our Secretary of State, could, quote, increase other countries' technological dependence and then use that dependence to impose its foreign policy preference. We can't let that happen. It's why policymakers have been examining the role that U.S. investments abroad are playing to enable foreign adversaries as they develop technologies that could take away our technological edge and damage our national security. Senators Casey and Cornyn introduced a bill designed to address these concerns by requiring notification of certain investments and enabling the president to prohibit others. I thank them for that introduction, and without objection, I'd like to enter into the record letters of support for that bill. The first from Representatives Delora and Pascrell, introducing companion legislation in the House. The second from the AFL-CIO, which supports that legislation without objection. So ordered. We need to better understand whether U.S. investments abroad pose national security risks. In a global economy where capital flows freely, we need to ensure we're not investing in technologies that harm our national security. Prior to creating CFIUS, we had not systematically tracked foreign investments into this country. Times change, and so do the threats we face. We must understand the scope of outbound investment and address the impact it plays in supporting efforts by our adversaries to achieve their foreign policy preferences. Protecting U.S. technological leadership is an important part of this conversation. It's why we're here today, but it's also not the whole story. And I talked with Senator Casey about this privately over the years many times. The story is an issue that Ohioans and Pennsylvanians, especially the industrial Midwest, know well. Over the last 30 or 40 years, corporations searched the globe for cheap labor. First, they went to anti-union states, shutting down in Pittsburgh or Cleveland and moving production to Mississippi or Alabama. Then corporations lobbied for tax breaks and bad trade deals to help move jobs overseas, always in search of lower wages. It started with manufacturing jobs. They didn't stop there. Corporations, in some case, moved R&D jobs abroad, too. Wall Street rewarded them over and over and over. In some cases, investments abroad outpaced investments in American workers, undermining our national security, and in so many communities in the industrial Midwest, but really all over the country, hollowed out our middle class. Protecting technological leadership, protecting jobs are connected. Ohioans know how much innovation happens on the shop floor. Investing in workers, infrastructure, education, R&D, and manufacturing will help shore up supply chains. From the infrastructure bill to chips and Science Act to the Inflation Reduction Act, this Congress is laying down a new marker. The technology of the future, from semiconductors to batteries to electric vehicles, will be developed in America and made in America by American workers. It hasn't been easy. Our work's far from finished. I'm optimistic. I look forward to working with the administration and my colleagues on this crucial issue for our economy. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to my colleagues. China's economic and military rise poses the greatest challenge to core U.S. interests since the end of the Cold War. Under Xi Jinping's autocratic rule, China is seeking to dominate the Indo-Pacific with clear security implications for U.S. allies and partners there, and they're engaging in relentless efforts to undermine human rights and American values, including free expression, the rule of law, and democratic governance. But recently, White House officials and a few of my Senate colleagues had advanced a peculiar idea that in order to fully meet this challenge posed by China, the United States should adopt some of the Chinese government's strategies for managing its economy. That thinking has led this Congress to enact industrial policy like new distortive taxpayer subsidies for semiconductor manufacturing. I thought that approach was a big mistake. But especially given that recent episode, I'm concerned about efforts to impose new capital controls on American investment in China. Now, advocates want a new regulatory regime so U.S. officials are notified of and can potentially stop U.S. investments in certain Chinese businesses. Now, if those investments credibly pose a risk to our national security, then I am not reflexively opposed to this concept. However, there are several reasons why we should proceed very carefully with this idea. Some claim that current U.S. legal authorities, including our dual-use export control system overseen by the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, are inadequate or incapable of addressing the risk posed by American investments in China. But it's important to remember that BIS regulates the flow of goods, software, and technology into jurisdictions and to end users of concern, including China, and that retains the force of law in the context of a U.S. investment. As Commerce Undersecretary Alan Estevez told this committee in July, BIS has complete authority to block the transfer of any kind of technology, intellectual property, blueprints, procedural know-how, or software going to China, including when made in the context of American investment in China. So what then is the need for an outbound investment notification regime? Well, in the words of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, it would capture outbound investments that, and I quote, circumvent the spirit of export controls, end quote. It appears that Mr. Sullivan was referring to certain U.S. investments in China that are legal under U.S. law but might be nevertheless of concern. It appears that Mr. Sullivan's concerned that investments that could result in the transfer of operational and managerial expertise and enhance the ability of Chinese firms to make sophisticated technologies that they might be prohibited from receiving if a U.S. company wanted to simply export those technologies. Well, the inherent problem with Mr. Sullivan's invoking the spirit of export controls is it's hard to define a spirit, and therefore it could be subject to expansive and varying interpretation. Now, I think we should carefully examine this issue. I'm concerned that the White House is reportedly rushing to issue an executive order that establishes an outbound investment regime unilaterally. Let me be very clear about this. An executive order is not a substitute for a new congressionally passed law. Legislation benefits from a deliberative, open, accountable, democratic process. A White House EO will inherently lack these characteristics, even if an EO is accompanied by a notice and comment period, and certainly it should not precede a law. In addition, an EO will, it's my understanding, very likely place no limits on what technologies can be added to the regime in the future. Now, why is it important to establish clear parameters on an outbound regime from the onset? Well, because time and again, presidents of both parties have misused sweeping national security authorities in ways far beyond what Congress initially intended. President Trump nearly used IEEPA to impose tariffs on Mexico over immigration policy. And Democrat and Republican senators were shocked when President Trump abused Section 232 National Security Authority to impose tariffs on U.S. partners and our closest allies. And frankly, we should all be equally opposed to the Biden administration's continuation of the Trump administration's abuse of power under Section 232, which continues to this day. So appropriately scoping an outbound regime is very, very important to preclude it from being used as a backdoor for trade protectionism in the future. It's absolutely vital that we prevail in this contest with China. And we can do this best by ensuring that the United States remains the single greatest global destination for capital formation, research and development, and the smartest minds in the world to come and work. Creating a flawed outbound investment regime would undermine our economic leadership, discouraging the flow of capital, ideas, and people into the United States. After all, why would you start a firm in the U.S. if you knew that doing so would risk precluding you from investing in China, the second largest economy in the world? So given these stakes, I'm recommending a set of principles to guide the creation of any outbound investment regime. And these principles are based on the premise that it would be wholly irresponsible to have a regime that does not have clear statutory boundaries on its application. Therefore, a notification regime for outbound American investments in China should, at a maximum, only be applicable to direct U.S. investments in Chinese entities that are manufacturing, producing, developing, or testing a technology for which a U.S. exporter would otherwise be required to seek a license under current U.S. law to export. I intend to solicit feedback on these principles, and I would like very much to work with Senators Cornyn, Casey, and Chairman Brown to incorporate them in the upcoming National Defense Authorization Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Today, the committee has the honor of welcoming Senator Casey of Pennsylvania, who came to the Senate in 2007, Senator Cornyn of Texas, who came 2 years earlier. When I joined this committee in 2007, Senator Casey and I sat down at the end of the dais. You could barely see the chairman's chair from there. And his has always been a critical voice for workers in the Senate. Welcome back, Bob. We also welcome back Senator Cornyn. It was just 5 years ago this month that Senator Cornyn testified before this committee on legislation to reform and strengthen our outbound investment review process. Thank you for that work. Today, we hear from them about the need for outbound investment screening and about their proposals. Senator Casey, proceed. Thank you.
Chairman Brown, thank you very much, and Ranking Member Toomey and members of the committee. I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify in support of an outbound investment screening mechanism. I'm grateful that Senator Cornyn is here with us today and for his ongoing partnership on this effort, as well as our colleagues in the House and the Senate who are sponsors of the legislation, the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, Senate Bill 1854, including in the House version of this legislation, Representatives DeLauro, Pascrell, Fitzpatrick, and Sparks. For decades, the United States has steadily ceded its manufacturing power to other countries, particularly foreign adversaries like the People's Republic of China. Outsourcing our manufacturing and supply chains has put our economic and national security at risk. The pandemic exacerbated this problem as we experienced shortages of PPE and computer chips simply because we were reliant on other countries to manufacture them and a broken supply chain to get them to us. In 2020, during the pandemic, I first introduced the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act to require targeted government screening of certain transactions by U.S. companies doing business in adversarial countries. The bill would help the U.S. better understand the risks of relying on foreign adversaries to design and manufacture goods critical to our economic and national security interests. Our goal must be to safeguard critical domestic industries and capabilities for American workers, manufacturers, and innovators. We must avoid any action that aids or abets our adversaries. Manufacturing, as we all know, is the foundation of our economic competitiveness. Working men and women in Pennsylvania, for example, have seen the damage that decades of offshoring and the hollowing out of American manufacturing strength and the knowledge that goes with it, what that does to those communities and those industries. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the People's Republic of China cost the United States 3.7 million jobs between 2001 and 2018. 2.8 million of those jobs, 3/4 of the total, were in manufacturing. In Pennsylvania, 137,300 of those jobs were our manufacturing jobs. But job numbers alone provide little insight into the family and community trauma, as well as the economic scarring that have ravaged so many small towns in Pennsylvania and other states. In key sectors such as communications equipment, electronics, and computer technology, we have ceded up to 40 to 60% of our domestic market share to Chinese imports. As U.S. firms continue to invest in high-tech and advanced services sectors, many of these investments have been made in countries that are owned, controlled, or influenced by the Chinese Communist Party. As of 2020, U.S. investments in Chinese companies totaled, in terms of capital investment, $152 billion to Chinese state-owned enterprises, $54 billion to Chinese military companies. At present, the U.S. has little knowledge of where these dollars are going and what sort of projects they may be supporting. We risk funding threats to our own national security. According to former U.S. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, venture capital firms are pouring billions into Chinese companies that are, quote, developing dual-use and sensitive technologies that are going to be weaponized against us or already are aiding and abetting the Russians, unquote. Without a mechanism or a process to understand the ways in which the export of U.S. investments and capabilities are resulting in a wholesale transfer of American R&D and expertise to our adversaries, without that, the U.S. is an active party in the decline of our own economic might and national security. The Chinese Communist Party has made clear its willingness to sever access to critical supply chains and use economic coercion to bully other nations. I won't give you examples of that. There are many in Australia and Lithuania and so many others. So I believe we have to confront a Chinese regime that is determined to cheat and bully its way to economic superiority. Some critics have said that outbound investment screening is something that should be left to the free market and private companies to sort out. Our adversaries, as we all know, will violate international law, and they'll ignore both private enterprise itself and free market rules. The People's Republic of China, its broader military and governmental ambitions, are intertwined with its trade and economic actions, because the Chinese government's agenda blurs the line between its economic and defense sectors by way of its civil-military fusion. When Chinese firms and state-owned enterprises compete against America's, it's done so with broader objectives in mind, including those of their military. It's up to U.S. policymakers, not international markets, to be vigilant regarding our national security, our manufacturing capacity, and the protection of our workers. There are significant gaps that exist in our export control programs and existing authorities. The U.S. should align our own outbound investment review mechanism with those of allies and partners such as South Korea and Taiwan, who have already taken the necessary steps to protect their national security. So I want to thank so many others who have worked on this in addition to Senator Cornyn, as I mentioned, and thank the administration for its support. And with that, and being a little bit more than a minute over, I'll conclude my remarks. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Senator Cornyn is recognized. John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Toomey, for scheduling this hearing on a very important topic. The Chairman's comments about the reforms we made to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States 5 years ago, it's amazing how quickly time flies, which have now been modeled by other countries, other democracies around the world because of the awareness of the threat of some foreign investment, forced technology transfers, and the like posed to not only those democracies' economies, but also to their national security. I'm pleased to be here with my friend, Senator Bob Casey. It's no coincidence that we are both members of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. We get regular reports, some we can't talk about here, about what our adversary, the People's Republic of China, is doing, but I think the contours are pretty well known in the open record. Deng Xiaoping opened up the Chinese economy, recognizing the only way they were going to be able to grow their economy was by soliciting foreign investment into that country from the United States. And they did a magnificent job. They are, as I think Senator Toomey mentioned, the second largest economy in the world and growing still, although they do have serious challenges, both economic and from a demographic standpoint. But there's no question that China poses a threat to our national security. We had hoped that they would join the liberal rules-based order, particularly when they were admitted to the World Trade Organization, but those hopes and wishes have certainly been dashed by the hard reality that Senator Casey mentioned a moment ago. It didn't take long for the openness that we hoped would follow was abused by the Chinese Communist Party through outright theft and control. And now we're seeing the vulnerabilities of an open door between our economies. The Chinese Communist Party has weaponized our trade and financial apparatuses and is using them to achieve control, dominance, and self-sufficiency in the area of our national critical capabilities. Made in China 2025 is just one example of that. And of course, they resort to all sorts of illicit means to secure access to not only our intellectual property, but also the know-how that lets them makes it more likely that they will achieve that goal. But as we look at technologies like semiconductors, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence, which are high on the list of priorities for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the U.S. is the only allied Pacific nation that provides domestic semiconductor incentives and does not have an outbound investment mechanism. The CCP's predatory trade practices paint an alarming picture for our national security, which requires a whole-of-government response, as well as that by American businesses, our friends and allies around the world, and those nations who at least attempt to abide by a rules-based international trading system. That said, to the point made by the ranking member, or my friend Senator Toomey, we must not overreach. Trade and investment with China must continue, and it will continue, so any legislative or regulatory action must be targeted. And I prefer whichever comes first. We need the scalpel, not the sword. The first step is to improve visibility into the human, financial, and intellectual capital in foreign adversary nations. We must know the full extent of the problem. Recently, we had an open hearing of the Intelligence Committee where one witness testified that the market value of American investments in the People's Republic of China was $2.3 trillion. American business has literally funded the rise of the People's Republic of China. And no one is suggesting that we decouple entirely, but we do need to look at this with our eyes wide open. I know a robust process that focuses on transparency and notification is the best answer. The American people should know that if a company is investing in critical industries in a foreign adversary's soil, and as you know, there is no real firewall between the People's Liberation Army and private businesses. They are compelled, businesses in China are compelled to share critical information with the People's Liberation Army that could be used for military purposes as well. And of course, in the event of a conflict with Taiwan or worse, our own men and women in uniform would be at a disadvantage to a Chinese military that was funded in part by an American company. I'd like to note this is not just a hypothetical. This happened. That's why it's so critical. There's an old saying attributed to Vladimir Lenin, the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. That's exactly what China is trying to do, using the enterprising minds of Americans to choke our own economy. The challenge we face with China, with regards in particular, requires a shift in our way of thinking, a new paradigm. This is not the China that Richard Nixon visited many years ago. The focus on proxy wars and diplomacy are a relic of the past. We need real action. That said, our government cannot risk playing politics with an important topic like outbound investment to settle centuries-old debates over protectionism versus free trade or labor versus big corporations. But I know we need to act soon. I agree with Senator Toomey that legislative action is far preferable to executive orders for a variety of reasons that we don't need to go into here. But I know that the administration, in my conversations with Secretary Raimondo in particular, they would welcome congressional action. And I think taking that initiative is very important, which is what Senator Casey and I have been trying to do for quite some time now. The perspectives of the panel, of this panel are very important, and I, again, welcome the continued conversation as we work our way to hopefully a negotiated outcome. And I like the idea suggested by Senator Toomey that maybe this would be a candidate for inclusion in the National Defense Authorization Act. But let me just say again, my thanks to Senator Casey for his leadership and for being such a productive partner. I appreciate the work of this committee on this topic, as I do the work that we've done in the past together on things like CFIUS. And I hope it is one of the several hearings to come that will provide additional and diverse perspectives and oversight on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn, Senator Casey. I know you both have busy schedules. That's my nice way of saying you're dismissed, and we need to have the witnesses sit there, so thank you for joining us in your thoughtful testimony. I'll introduce the second panel as they arrive. Sarah Bauerle Danzman is an associate professor of international studies at Indiana University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Consul. Previously, she was a consul on foreign relations working in the Office of Investment Affairs of the State Department. Welcome, Ms. Bauerle Danzman. The Honorable Richard Ashooh is the former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration, currently Vice President of Global Trade, Government Affairs for Lam Research Corporation. Welcome, Mr. Ashooh. The Honorable Thomas Feddo, First Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Investment Security, after FIRMA created the position leading the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. Presently, he is the founder of the Rubicon Advisors. Welcome, Mr. Feddo. And last, joined by an Ohioan and Denison University graduate, where my father and brother went, Mr. Robert Strayer served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber International Communication and Information Policy at the State Department. He's now the Executive Vice President of Policy, Information Technology Industry Council. Thank you all for joining us. And Ms. Bauerle Danzman, please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey, as well as your hardworking staff, for inviting me to testify on outbound investment. It truly is an honor to speak with the committee today. I'm an associate professor of international studies at the Hamilton Lugar School at Indiana University, where I studied the intersection of national security and investment policy. As a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, I worked as a policy advisor and CFIUS staffer in the Office of Investment Affairs at the Department of State in 2019 and 2020. And as a fellow at the Atlantic Council, I have had the distinct pleasure of co-leading a policy working group on outbound investment controls with Emily Kilcrease of the Center for New American Security. Emily and I recently published a policy brief where we lay out our suggestions for how to design an appropriately scoped outbound screening mechanism. Much of my comments today draw directly from that co-authored report. I want to spend my time offering 5 observations that Congress should keep in mind while contemplating outbound investment controls. First, there are some actual real gaps in the United States' ability to address national security risks associated with some kinds of outbound investment. Export controls can stop the flow of U.S. technology to these activities, but active forms of U.S. investment, particularly foreign direct investment and venture capital, can provide intangible benefits to the Chinese firms and industries in which they invest, and we do not currently have controls on that. Second, Congress should resist temptations to use outbound investment screening for purposes other than national security. To be consistent with a longstanding commitment to open markets, the authority to intervene in an outbound transaction must be limited to a fact-based national security risk assessment, as is the case with inbound investment through the CFIUS process. It is my assessment that any outbound screen should focus on the national security risks associated with indigenous technology technology development in countries of concern. Third, Congress should recognize the uncertainty that pervades this issue. Current data collection on U.S. investment flows to China are not detailed enough to be able to assess the national security implications of individual transactions. A notification regime could help to scope the size of the problem and is an important first step. An executive order related to outbound screening may be a good first step because it would also allow for more experimentation before committing to a statutory requirement. This mirrors the experience of CFIUS, which was first established through executive order in 1975 and only gradually became a statutory requirement through a series of amendments to the Defense Production Act. Fourth, Congress should not assume that a mirror image of CFIUS will work for outbound screening. The enforcement issues associated with regulating the movement of investment abroad is more challenging to address than regulating inbound flows. Congress should only move forward with a screening concept if it is reasonably sure that it has adequate monitoring and enforcement capabilities to give the regulation teeth. And finally, Congress should think in network terms when contemplating which technologies a screening regime should cover. An administrable outbound investment review system will need to be relatively narrow in scope. We should avoid a boiling the ocean mentality. A broadly scoped review is likely to generate substantial negative consequences for U.S. companies' competitiveness and capacity to innovate. Congress can narrow its focus while remaining maximally effective by examining technology choke points in supply chain networks, where U.S. firms currently have the advantage and where process and know-how are central to the production of these technologies. Technologies for which China has the least domestic capacity tend to be in areas with very high quality control specifications. These kinds of technologies are likely of high national security value, require substantial know-how to perfect, and have outsized follow-on effects to other technologies relevant to U.S. national security. Those would be good candidates for review. However, we should be wary of overreach. Prudent policy must balance the national security imperative to deny countries of concern indigenous capabilities in technologies of high national security import, while also avoiding an overly restrictive regime that would actually inadvertently further push Chinese entities towards self-sufficiency. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bauerle. Danzman. Mr. Ashooh, welcome.
It's good to be with you and also with you, Ranking Member Toomey. It's an honor to be here today. Having served as Assistant Secretary at BIS, I contended with many of the issues which are the subject of today's hearing, and I certainly share the concerns that were stated in both your statements. And it's in that capacity, my experience at BIS, that I'd like to testify today and share with you. The concerns at the heart of this hearing are well-founded. From the moment of my swearing in at BIS, the challenges presented by the PRC were apparent, serious, and alarming. While great strides have been made in addressing these concerns, national security is never static and must be constantly addressed. And much of what has been accomplished is the result of legislation this committee championed, as has already been mentioned in 2018, which led to the Export Control Reform Act and the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, ECRA and FIRMA. And I would like to take a minute to underscore my gratitude to the committee for the thoughtful approach that it took at that time, which involved bipartisan, bicameral, and multi-jurisdictional legislating to advance long overdue modernization of some very complex and powerful authorities. Any consideration of measures which could significantly alter U.S. capital flows merits a similarly thoughtful and thorough approach. I'll confine my comments today to 3 recommendations that are drawn from the lessons learned in the implementation and passage of FIRMA and ECRA. First, clearly define the national security threat to be addressed. While this objective appears obvious, the temptation to address a broad panoply of otherwise legitimate concerns that don't necessarily meet the test of national security is very alluring. However, a fundamental premise in national security is specificity. During the ECRA and FIRMA debate, concerns over joint ventures with Chinese companies led to a robust discussion of whether to expand the scope of CFIUS to regulate that activity. Once the key issue is distilled to one of concerns over technology transfer, the purview of export controls, the appropriate tailoring of ECRA could occur, thanks in large part to the concomitant updating of that law along with FIRMA. Second, I recommend in this area that we regulate horizontally. National security threats are rarely stovepiped, and solutions to address them should not be either. Multiple agencies must collaborate. The Department of State regulates persons, Treasury the financing, and Commerce the technology. One of the most crucial updates in FIRMA and ECRA was to dovetail their respective definitions and authorities which established a unified definition of critical technologies, which grounded that definition in well-defined export restriction criteria, such as the Commerce Control List and the United States Munitions List under ITAR. This created clear, specific, updatable tools for regulating. And since the Commerce List categorizes countries and restricts them based on national security concerns, this obviated the need for Treasury to develop its own country criteria, another robustly debated issue at that time. This synchronization is a model for enhancing the power and effectiveness of U.S. policy implementation. Third, I recommend building on what works. For all the progress made because of and since the passage of FIRMA and ECRA, gaps do exist. As has already been mentioned, it's possible that export-controlled technology could be the beneficiary of U.S. financing, intentionally or not. This disconnect is one which could be addressed through alterations to current authorities. ECRA and FIRMA allowed the two regimes to reinforce each other as complementary tools to protect national security. As a CFIUS reviewing agency, Commerce has the opportunity to vet applicants against other important national security authorities, such as compliance with the Export Control System and the Defense Priorities and Allocation System, also known as DPAS, making for an even more comprehensive national security review. A recent enhancement to the Export Administration regulations defines the term support by U.S. persons to include, among other things, financing. While further study must be conducted, this feature of the law creates a regulatory hook to limit financial activities based on export restrictions. Amendments to current authorities hold the potential to address the most pressing concerns regarding outbound investments without, as has been proposed, the establishment of an additional, entirely new regime with potentially overlapping or conflicting authorities. Finally, just as alignment among relevant agencies and authorities is critical, consideration must be given to alignment with partner nations. Since passage of FIRMA and ECRA, many like-minded countries have embarked on similar national security reviews of both foreign direct investment screening and export controls. It's clear from the behavior of our allies that the U.S. led in these areas, resulting in a more global and therefore far more effective approach. It should continue this leadership in this area, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ashooh. Mr. Feddo, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and distinguished members of the committee. When I last appeared before you, I was fortunate to receive your endorsement to be the Treasury Department's first ever Assistant Secretary for Investment Security. In that role, I oversaw the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, including the successful implementation of FIRMA in 2018. By virtue of that experience and over 20 years of service in national security-related capacities, I hope to contribute to your consideration of outbound investment screening. At the outset, I'll say that I believe we're engaged in one of history's most consequential great power competitions, and that technology plays a key role in that contest. In the 90s, I was an officer on a Los Angeles-class submarine. The boat was a tech marvel, carrying the world's most sophisticated weapons and equipment, largely a result of America's innovation ecosystem. My submarine service has made crystal clear the imperative for maintaining America's technology advantage. The PRC poses grave threats to the United States, its allies, and global order, including its strategy to exploit technology, raw materials, market power, and energy resources to achieve its ends. Key supply chains, such as semiconductors, are vulnerable to these same goals. The 2018 enactment of FIRMA and ECRA was largely in response to the potential risks arising from foreign actors' activity with high-tech U.S. businesses. Now, both Congress and the Biden administration are considering a new agency with potentially sweeping powers to oversee American firms' allocation of property and capital outside the United States. A version of this interagency panel was considered in this year's CHIPS bill. The regime would have limited investments, sharing of IP, financing, and even sales that could benefit a country of concern, in a wide list of sectors. Key terms were broad and undefined and left substantial latitude to the executive branch. Virtually every U.S. business transacting internationally could have been impacted. Subsequent proposals were narrowed, but I believe more homework is still necessary. Recent reporting says the administration is close to establishing outbound screening by executive order. I strongly believe that doing so would be a significant mistake. Rather, Congress is best suited to assess and respond to an issue of this complexity and potential scope and impact. There should be no dispute that to ensure America's security, the PRC's technology theft must be prevented. The question is whether a new and potentially far-reaching bureaucracy is the answer. The debate has taken on an apparent presumption that outbound screening is necessary, but decision makers would greatly benefit by resisting that temptation to rush into a solution. I commend the committee for today's hearing. There should be more before any solution is enacted to define objectives and determine costs and benefits. When a bipartisan Congress and the Trump administration collaborated to make the most extensive changes to CFIUS in its history, those efforts included roughly a half dozen hearings with national security experts, the IC, the private sector, and former and current senior administration officials. Congress and the President were thus well informed as to the gaps they intended to fill, the law's reach, and the intended increases in capacity and cost. Afterwards, it took 2 intensive years with an existing CFIUS bureaucracy to effectively implement the law. Here, outbound screening would be out of whole cloth. As with FIRMA, decision makers would be best served by building a comprehensive record, exploring whether existing or other authorities could be less bureaucratic and costly and more impactful. These options don't appear to have been fully considered, but they may in fact offer a better cost-benefit calculus. My written testimony includes a foundational list of issues for a fulsome congressional examination of outbound screening. Excuse me. From my CFIUS experience, I know that a new screening mechanism would be time and resource intensive and require substantial effort to build a clear regulatory framework and have the key human capital to ensure success. It's an honor to contribute today to your scrutiny of this consequential matter. To H.L. Mencken is attributed the wisdom that for every complicated problem, there is a solution, easy, simple, and wrong. In the interest of national security, a strong, open economy, and accountable government, all Americans should hope and expect policymakers to get this right. The alternative could be an unrestrained bureaucracy, wasted time and resources, and no meaningful response to the PRC's ominous goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Feddo. This may be the only hearing ever where H.L. Mencken and earlier Senator Cornyn quoted Lenin. So the scope of that, I don't quite know how to analyze. Mr. Strayer, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Toomey, I'm currently the lead of the Global Policy Team at the Information Technology Industry Council, or ITI. ITI represents 80 global leading companies from across the ICT sector, including hardware, software, semiconductors, network equipment, and cybersecurity. The U.S. government has no more important responsibility than to protect the nation's security. ITI therefore commends the committee for holding this hearing. It is essential that there be a structured, deliberative process to include the views of all stakeholders on outbound investments. We also appreciate the leadership of Senators Cornyn and Casey on this issue and for their letter this week calling for robust stakeholder engagement. We are committed to working with Congress and the administration to achieve effective national security outcomes. U.S. national security depends on continued U.S. technological leadership. Today, other nations and their companies are competing to find the next transformational technology. Global competition in tech innovation is occurring in increasingly rapid cycles. U.S. companies must use the profits earned from global sales of current products to fund future R&D of the next improved generation of products. Companies also face fierce competition on cost and efficiency. U.S. companies use global supply chains to access the best talent, components, and manufacturing capabilities to be competitive. Global markets for sales and diversified supply chains are therefore vital to American technological leadership, and that leadership contributes to a shared goal of enhancing U.S. national security. U.S. government policies have helped companies run faster and better compete in global markets. The incentives in the recently enacted CHIPS and Science Act are a good example of incentives to build up U.S. tech capabilities. ITI was a steadfast supporter of this legislation and appreciate Congress passing that legislation. As the U.S. government examines ways to maintain its technological advantage and protect national security, there are 5 considerations that will help an outbound investment framework be successful. First, it is imperative that policymakers examine existing authorities, identify gaps that implicate national security, and craft new authorities in a manner that is sufficiently narrow to avoid capturing transactions already subject to existing regimes. For example, the U.S. Commerce Department has extensive authority to restrict the transfer of technology, software, and commodities to and from countries and entities of concern. Second, we should be specific and targeted about national security risks of the technologies and investments to be covered. My perspective on this point is shaped by my time at the U.S. State Department. I served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy there. In that role, I was responsible for leading the U.S. government's international 5G security campaign. And I was also involved in planning to protect U.S. technology networks. In 2018, we identified that significant risk was related to one particular type of technology platform, wireless 5G networks. And we focused the U.S. government on a government-wide campaign to establish policies to protect the United States and to convince our foreign partners and allies to adopt consistent policies that was based on a government-wide strategy. A similar degree of focus on particular technologies is needed for the U.S. government to be successful in outbound investment screening. Its scope needs to be manageable and enforceable, and the rationale must be understood by the private sector and allied governments. An assessment of emerging technologies should be done by the intelligence community and other experts in the U.S. government and the private sector. That would help identify the most transformative technologies and consider their impacts on economic growth, national security, and military capabilities, as well as an adversary's ability to monopolize that technology. That analysis should take place before a framework enters into force. Third, the U.S. government should consult with industry regularly. The private sector has the best data and understanding of supply chains. It can share this information with the government to design policies that achieve U.S. goals while minimizing costs to supply chains. Fourth, companies need as much certainty as possible to plan in time to adjust their supply chains. In most cases, those take years to develop. The best way to provide certainty is with clear lines about the investments that will be covered by regulatory restrictions. Fifth, build international coalitions. It is critically important that new regulatory mechanisms be coordinated with U.S. allies and partners to ensure that U.S. actions do not cause investments to leave the United States and be made through countries that do not have similar investment restrictions. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Strader. Thank you all for your thoughtful comments on a complicated subject. Start with you, Dr. Bauerle, Danzman, if I could. You state there are, quote, gaps, unquote, in the U.S. ability to address national security risks associated with outbound investment. Elaborate, if you would, on what those gaps are and the type of risks associated with those gaps.
Absolutely. So, when we're talking about gaps in authority, we're really addressing whether there are certain kinds of intangible benefits that U.S. investment provides that are separate from technology transfer and thereby not addressable through export controls. I lay out some of this in my written testimony, but I really focus on two kinds of active investment: FDI and venture capital. Let's set aside portfolio flows, which are just passive financial investments and not suitable for screening. So for FDI, for example, a semiconductor company building a fabrication plant in China or a software development company opening an AI R&D facility in China, there is a vast literature on the role of FDI in broader economic development of receiving states. This literature focuses on identifying positive spillovers to local industry from FDI, usually through knowledge, know-how, and market-making channels. Multinationals can act as catalysts for domestic industry. They do so even through these non-tech transfer channels. Multinationals help foster indigenous industries by incorporating local firms into their supply chains, by importing knowledge about international markets, through building connections to multinationals' broader supplier and buyer networks, and by transferring managerial practices that encourage efficiency and quality control. We know that by interacting with multinationals, domestic firms gain foreign market knowledge to directly compete in international markets. And domestic firms that integrate into multinational supply chains are actually statistically significantly more likely to become exporters, to increase their ability to supply the domestic market, as well as to produce higher quality and more complex products. This is how developing countries move up the value chain. And these are all less tangible contributions to the domestic market that are not controllable through export controls, and normally they shouldn't be, right? Normally, all of these spillover effects of FDI are beneficial to economic development, and this is a success story that illustrates how economic integration can generate shared prosperity. So in general, this is a good thing for everyone involved. But in very narrow cases, we may want to prevent U.S. firms from building China's innovation ecosystem in technologies that are so vital to U.S. national security that we just cannot afford to cede that tech to the PRC. And then in terms of venture capital, we all know that the whole point of venture capital is not just the investment, but that investors provide mentorship and advice to founders who need substantial strategic and logistical help to scale up their businesses. Venture capital play prominent roles on corporate boards. They provide founders and their teams with access to investors' financial, commercial, professional, and even political networks. A company with VC funding is able to leverage the legitimacy of its funder to find more investors, board members, and customers. Again, venture is an essential part of our innovation ecosystem. 42% of U.S. companies that went public from 1974 to 2015 were venture-backed, right? So as a general matter, we should encourage venture. But on the flip side, these same features that have been so central to the journey from startup to commercial viability in the United States could generate national security risks if U.S. Venture contributes to critical technology startups in countries of concern.
Thank you. Let me ask you another question, and we're down to about a minute.
Sorry.
In the paper you co-authored with Emily Kilcrease, you call for a broad notification requirement that would provide additional information to investors on certain investments. How should policymakers consider the scope of such a notification requirement?
So in that paper, we believe that starting with export controls is a kind of good way to mirror. Basically, outbound review should mirror U.S. export controls, similar to the solution that Senator Toomey forwarded just a few minutes ago. So if you need a license to export an item to China, you need a review before investing in a Chinese company developing or operating in that same technology. The inevitable criticism of that approach is that it leaves out emerging technologies. So we also suggest that it may be useful to go through a process of narrowing the critical and emerging technology list to a few areas that matter on that list as well that are not currently controlled. The important part there is to have a public notice and comment period that really allows to get down to greater specificity in terms of what the precise technology would be so that it is administrable.
Thank you. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I quoted Jake Sullivan's definition of or indication of why this was necessary, in which he said the problem is circumventing the spirit of export controls. I don't quote that because I want to criticize or mock this. What I want to do is underscore the sort of imprecise and vague and not terribly well-defined nature of the problem we're trying to solve. So maybe we could start, and Professor, I have to ask you to please be very, very short if you could. If you could give us a specific example of a transaction, a process, something that is not captured under existing export controls and you think we would all agree is problematic.
I'm sure. So I don't claim to speak for the National Security Advisor, and I also share many of the concerns that you mentioned before about, making sure to scope.
Right.
But as a hypothetical, Commerce recently announced 4 new tech controls under Section 1758. One newly controlled technology is a specific electronic computer aid design software that
Okay,
is...
but this
Yeah.
is, just to be
Yeah.
clear, this is a hypothetical.
Right, this
not-
is a hypothetical. I don't want to talk about specific transactions.
Do you
I
know
wanna
of
talk-
specific transactions?
Yes, but I don't want to talk about specific transactions that would implicate a
Okay.
particular
Well,
company. So I'm just saying that if a U.S. company invested in a Chinese entity that was trying to develop this controlled technology indigenously, then, but it was trying to develop it indigenously without using U.S.
Yeah.
controlled tech, that would be an indication, in my mind, of a company trying to circumvent the spirit of export controls.
All right. There's another aspect to this. Maybe Mr. Ashooh, am I saying that correctly, Mr. Ashooh?
It rhymes with cashew.
Okay, Mr. Ashooh. China's obviously got a lot of accumulated capital. There's plenty of money. Government has enormous resources. Private sector has enormous resources. So would you agree that if there's a problem here, the problem isn't providing money. The problem is something else. And we know that the export restriction regime has the ability to limit the export of products, including software. So it seems to me what we're really getting at here, what comes up periodically in the discussion, is this much more difficult to define concept of like know-how, expertise, professionalism, process, a way of doing business that is likely to enhance your ability to be successful. Is that, how would you react to that characterization of what seems to me to be the thing that folks are going after?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I actually think there's only one area that, in a specific way, presents a disconnect between the goals and the authorities, and that's cash money. It's conceivable that an end user that would be export restricted could still receive U.S. investment, and that to me is a disconnect. I don't have a specific example because during my time at BIS, I didn't encounter one. But I think it's important to, on the question of associated transfer of intangibles like know-how, the Export Administration Regulations covers that. It defines technology primarily as information. So it's important to think it's not just the phone or this pen, it's the manual that goes with it. That's technology. That is controlled in whatever form, usually intangible, that it goes. So we have a very robust and textured series of regulations that are already in place that with some adjustment could address whatever concerns there are.
Mr. Feddo, I wonder if you could address, we're at a situation where we might have an executive order come out in the absence of legislation. We might be able to get legislation done. Could you just discuss a little bit your sense of how important it is that whatever is done here is defined in statute by Congress?
Senator, I think this is the prerogative of the Congress. It's Article 1 of the Constitution for a reason, and you have explicit authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Such a complicated issue in question, and the problem hasn't been sufficiently designed. An executive order that creates this committee, when you create a committee like this, a bureaucracy, it's not going to be unwrung. But there's so many questions, as I list in my written testimony, that I think need to be answered in terms of capacity, how many transactions we expect to capture, what sort of risk analysis would be involved, how are we going to fund this committee, accountability, who's in charge and has the institutional heft within the executive branch to move forward and implement it in an appropriate way, and then answer to committees of jurisdiction in oversight. All of that comes with legislation and not necessarily with an executive order. The statute also gives an opportunity, as I've maintained, for the Congress to build a record, to get folks from the administration on the record to identify the problem and answer precisely the question you just posed to my fellow witnesses about an example of a gap. Those sorts of things we did during FIRMA. The Treasury Department, Commerce, DOD came up here and worked with you all and explained gaps. We had the intelligence community brief the Congress on the gaps that needed to be filled. As far as I'm aware, that sort of dialogue and establishment of a record and a foundation for this kind of committee has not yet been executed here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a country, we need to consider, I believe, how we regulate outbound investments of critical sectors as part of our broader economic resiliency strategy. The COVID pandemic revealed structural weaknesses in the United States supply chain, and we're still feeling the pain of those vulnerabilities today. So, Professor Danzman, what were some of the consequences of having so much of our critical production abroad, particularly in countries like China?
Thank you for the question. I think that when we think specifically about the supply chain shocks that we experienced because of COVID, we should separate out what were demand shocks plus supply shocks of zero COVID policy versus national security concerns for extended periods of time, right? So the CHIPS Act in particular has been working to, the idea behind that is to bring back some supply and to diversify the supply chain so that we're not over-reliant on just a few nodes in the chip supply chain. But I think that kind of we want to be careful to not overlearn the example of the COVID pandemic, which was very much about shocks to the system that are now working themselves out.
Yeah, but it's interesting, shocks to the system that we're working out. But at the same time, we had doctors and nurses who had to improvise in the creation of personal protective gear as we struggled to get it from other parts of the world. I don't know what the next virus will be. There will be one at some point. Hopefully not, but at some point there will be one. And we have to think about that. Let me ask you, would a lack of a comprehensive outbound investment strategy for certain critical sectors mitigate the benefits of recent efforts to strengthen our supply chains?
Well, I think when we consider the reasons why firms move overseas, it's normally because of commercial viability in the U.S. And so if the goal of the Congress is to ensure that we retain some amount of domestic capabilities, there are other measures that we should use beyond prohibiting outbound investment to actually help on the side of making those types of investments in the U.S. commercially viable.
Okay. Well, I believe our lack of outbound investment oversight in sensitive industries has the potential to hamper the competitiveness of our firms. Practices such as intellectual property theft are all too common in parts of the world, especially China, which harm the ability of U.S. firms that are playing by the rules to compete. So, Mr. Feddo and Mr. Ashooh, how has the stolen intellectual property in countries like China degraded our economic competitiveness and national security?
Thank you for the question, Senator. It's an incredibly important issue. It's hard to measure how it's degraded because, regrettably, it's not limited only to China. Intellectual property theft is a global issue, quite frankly, which makes it all the harder to deal with. And during my time at BIS, we were often confronted with the question that in the presence of an IP violation, should we then take an export action? And that was a reasonable request because the ability to deal with IP theft in the courts is insufficient. The bomb's already gone off. The information's already been purloined. And even if you pursue legal action, how do you undo that? You can't really disgorge the IP. Export controls as a solution to that are not ideal. So it is worth us contemplating how else to get at it, because the legal system, it's important, it's necessary, it needs to be used, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Sir, thank you for the question. I'll just add, recently FBI Director Wray commented that every 12 hours the FBI is opening a new investigation related to espionage or hacking or something that relates to theft of intellectual property. The FBI actually has on its website a wheel of doom, I'll call it, that lists all the different ways that the CCP steals our technology. Everything from espionage to hacking to research partnerships to academic institutions, inbound investment, the CFIUS problem. And so all of that is part of the calculus. And his estimate was that, his comment was that over 2,000 active investigations by the FBI at the time he made the comment. And so I'm not sure how to quantify that, but I think that the damage to our intellectual property and our know-how is profound. What I would say is, to me, it brings home the point that we need more information. I think many who have testified today have commented, we don't fully understand the problem, and so we need to gather more data, the problem that is with risk from outbound investment, and how it compares, for example, to hacking and espionage and the other risks that we face, and whether the cost benefit is there with respect to how much resources we dedicate to one versus another.
Yeah, I would just close by saying I think that maybe one of the things that outbound investment would help us with, it seems to me that we want American companies, obviously, to continue to compete in the global economy. By the same token, it seems to me that we need to preserve the apex, the tip of the iceberg, of the most sophisticated, sensitive elements that we need to preserve to have a competitive edge and a security edge, and that the rest of what's underneath of that tip that might be generally commercially available is a way to look at how we can continue to be competitive. But I think there are some sectors, it seems to me, that we have to be concerned about not only the economic equation, but the security equation as well. Thank you very much.
Senator Tester of Montana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the folks that are here testifying today. I appreciate your testimony. In my real life, I'm a farmer, and been on the land between my parents, grandparents, and myself for 110 years plus. One of the things that I'm somewhat concerned about, but that's why I'm asking the question, is the potential to buy up farmland from a foreign country, potentially even a foreign adversary country. I'll direct at you, Mr. Feddo, but anybody can jump in if you want to add value. And that is this something that we're seeing, number one, or is this something that we're even tracking?
I'll answer the second part first. I'm not sure to what extent we're tracking it. I have seen as to whether it's a problem. I'm aware that there's increasing reporting about buying up land. Certainly with respect to CFIUS, the Congress provided the committee jurisdiction over real estate investments, land investments, close to military installations and otherwise. That provides us some overlap, some jurisdiction to look at those types of investments. But as to other agriculture-related investments, I'm not aware of the scope of the problem, but it is something that attention has been raised and I think is worth this committee and others thinking about.
Anybody else want to add to that? So I appreciate your answer, and I understand we can't look at everything, but the fact that we're not doing this and food supply is pretty critical to national security, and you can screw the food supply up pretty easily. The thought comes to my mind about putting nitrogen fertilizer in grain, which adds protein on a test, but also poisons the product, is a big deal. I would hope somebody, whose job would it be to look at that? I'm talking about people buying land up in the U.S. Do we have an agency that would?
I think it was appropriate to direct the question to Tom, because I think CFIUS does exist to look at national security implications of acquisitions. And the real estate scope did grow substantially. I think, Senator, what you're saying, and this is a very good thought, which is food security is really an infrastructure issue, which has grown to become a national security issue. So my view is the authority is there. Getting those definitions right is something that with Congress's help, should be looked at.
How about from an agribusiness standpoint? Do we look at that at all? Do you know? I'll say to you, Mr. Feddo, again, how about foreign purchasing of agribusinesses? Is anybody looking at that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the core jurisdiction of the committee. If a foreign business buys a U.S. business, it's within the jurisdiction for consideration of national security risk.
So I probably need to visit with Sumi offline, but I'll just give you an example. And I'm not saying that these guys aren't legit. I don't know that they are. I don't know that they're not. But there's a lot of land being purchased around me in north central Montana by Canadians. I don't know if it's Canadian money, though. It may be money from somewhere else. And if nobody's checking this out, and I don't know how hard it would be to check this out, I just don't know. It seems to me that we're opening ourselves up for a risk that we might regret later. That's all. So let me, the previous question, Senator Menendez was talking about intellectual property theft and research partners and universities is one of the places. I'll go to you, Ms. Danzman, because you're from Indiana University, a great university in this country. Is the university aware that there might be, look, we've had very open government, and we've wanted to work together and share information. I think it's foundational to who we are as a nation, by the way. But when people are trying to steal stuff, that puts a little different light on it. Is a place like Indiana University aware of what kind of threats are out there when we're talking particularly about research, but it could fall into a lot of other areas too?
I appreciate the question. Academics really value the openness of science, and so that's an important part of what it means to be in the global academy.
Yes.
At the same time, it is the case that I know that the FBI goes around to universities and works with universities to discuss the risks that are that we currently need to be thinking about in our current environment, particularly around the development of technologies that do have important dual use. And I think that that's a very important thing for the FBI to be doing, and that program should be probably expanded.
Okay, so you think it's important they're doing, but the adequacy may need to be, adequacy isn't where it needs to be.
You might also look at, in the EU, there has been some recent movement on this issue, specifically around who is funding universities and university research. And so this is an issue that I imagine the US and EU Trade and Technology Council is also engaged with as well.
The more I learn, the more I'm scared. Thanks.
Thanks, Senator Test. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So last month, President Biden made an historic investment in our future by signing the CHIPS and Science Act into law. So in addition to boosting federal funding for scientific research, yay, the law provides $52 billion in subsidies to revitalize our domestic semiconductor manufacturing industry. Now, semiconductor chips are critical ingredients for everything from cell phones to cars. So this is a very important investment to strengthen our supply chains, create good union jobs, and bring down prices for consumers. But to ensure that corporations exclusively use CHIPS funds for these purposes, rather than simply for boosting their own profits, Congress put guardrails up, and one of these guardrails prohibits semiconductor manufacturers from using CHIPS funds for buying back their own stock. Stock buybacks mainly serve to manipulate share prices and boost corporate executives' profits, money that could instead be used to build a factory or hire workers or invest in worker training. So, Dr. Bauerle Danzman, you're an expert on investment in critical sectors like semiconductors. So let me just ask you, the CHIPS and Science Act clearly prohibits chip manufacturers like Intel or IBM from using CHIPS funds to conduct stock buybacks. But could Intel or IBM accept CHIPS funds and then use its own money for stock buybacks?
Possibly.
All right, so here's the issue. If Intel is awarded CHIPS funds, it is required to use those funds to fulfill the purposes of the CHIPS program. I totally get this, but money is money. Money is fungible. By taking CHIPS funds, Intel would have more money, which might free up other funds that it could then use for stock buybacks. You know, this is not a hypothetical risk. Between 2011 and 2020, 5 of the largest semiconductor companies, Intel, IBM, Qualcomm, Texas Instrument, and Broadcom, all of which heavily lobbied for the CHIPS Act, spent $250 billion, or 70% of their collective profits, 5 times more than we put into the CHIPS Act, on what? On stock buybacks. Just a few weeks ago, Texas Instruments authorized a new $15 billion stock buyback program. Now, Secretary Raimondo says CHIPS funds won't be used for buybacks on her watch, period. Commerce said CHIPS money is not, quote, a subsidy for companies to make them more profitable or enable them to have more cash for stock buybacks or to pad their bottom lines, end quote. So, Dr. Bauerle Danzman, why is it important that the Commerce Department lives up to its promises that taxpayer funds in the CHIPS programs aren't used directly or indirectly to fund stock buybacks or other shareholder payouts?
Thank you for the question. It's important. When you're designing these sorts of subsidy programs, it's important to get the balance right because you want the companies to actually take the funds and to expand production, which is good for national security and good for American workers. That said, taxpayers are investing billions of dollars in the semiconductor manufacturing industry on the basis of 2 things, right? The U.S. will be physically safer and more economically resilient if we build back more of this capacity, and that reshoring is not commercially viable without government support. And if we see a lot of stock buybacks, this is going to undermine the U.S. public support for these sorts of programs. And that will make it harder to appropriate such funds in the future, as well as if we're not expanding domestic production as much as we should, that could have national security consequences.
So thank you very much. I mean, you've got a lot of points in there about why it is important that the money we invest means that the companies are spending money on reinvesting and not on something like stock buybacks. How do we get there? That means tougher rules like requiring companies on the application to attest that they will not engage in stock buybacks, by giving additional preferences to companies that commit to longer buyback moratoria, by clawing back funds from companies that go back on their word. So I'm looking forward to working with Secretary Raimondo and my colleagues to ensure that this critical investment onshores our supply chain, creates those good union jobs, lowers prices for families, and powers our economy into the future in ways we intended, rather than helps line the pockets of the CEOs of these giant corporations. I appreciate your work in this area and hope we can work together to get this done. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Warner. Senator Van Hollen of Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. Thank all of you for your testimony. I think we can all agree that it's important for the United States to maintain its competitive edge in areas that are critical to our national security, our economy, areas of strategic importance. The CHIPS and Science Bill, which we passed, was a really important part of that. Making sure that we do our business here at home is a critical piece. Another piece is to make sure we don't allow companies, and a lot of companies associated with foreign governments, to steal U.S. intellectual property. Senator Sass and I introduced a bill that's part of the current conference of what remains of USICA to do that so that U.S. companies who have had their IP stolen don't have to take a case-at-a-time approach on patent infringement, but the U.S. government can take action through sanctions to make it very clear that we're not going to be firing with a BB gun, economic BB gun, but we're going to have more strength. The third is this topic that we're discussing today. And I do think most of us share a concern that without some sufficient government oversight, transparency, guidelines, that U.S. outbound investment could strengthen the capabilities of China or other adversaries in areas that are of strategic importance to the United States. I mean, that's what we're focused on here. I think there are good faith disagreements as to how you define the scope, exactly what the mechanism is to implement that. But it does seem to me that in order to be effective, in addition to figuring out how we want to do this here at home, what kind of mechanism we want, we also have to make sure that our allied partners adopt similar mechanisms. Ms. Danzman, would you agree with that?
I do not think you can overstate the importance of multilateral engagement on this issue.
Right, and just each of you, yes or no, in terms of whether you agree with that principle.
Strongly agree.
Yeah.
Likewise, multilateral efforts are always stronger than going it alone.
Agree.
Right. So, you know, with FIRMA, we created a mechanism to create an incentive for our partners overseas, allies overseas, to adopt similar mechanisms to our CFIUS process. And it seems to me, whatever we decide in terms of the shape and form of rules that apply to outbound investment or transparency, it will only be effective if we get our partners around the world to adopt it for a couple of reasons. One is if they don't, they can send capital to support the same sort of investments in strategically important areas. And number two, that would then put U.S. firms at a disadvantage because we're essentially saying that we're not going to allow this, but leave the door open for others. Could you address where we stand right now in those conversations? And are there any of our partner countries today who have adopted a screening process on their outbound investments? I don't know who's best to answer that.
I can at least make an initial comment, and I am aware that outbound screening exists in some of our allied partners, but I'd like to take the moment to talk about the multilateralism that exists today. There was a bit of a common theme here among the witnesses, which is that an initial step in any outbound screening criteria should be to synchronize it with the existing national security criteria that exist between CFIUS and the export control system, and to look at whether or not outbound screening should align with that. The export controls are overwhelmingly multilateral. So that work is already in place in many ways. Not completely, work needs to be done, but there's a lot to work with there right now.
Any others, Ms. Danzman?
Sure. So both South Korea and Taiwan have very narrowly scoped outbound screening mechanisms. So that answers one of your questions. I'm not currently in the government, so I don't know how much there has been discussion at the multilateral level specifically around this issue. But in informal conversations with those over in the EU, this seems like this is going to really take a long time to develop a shared understanding of the problem and of the likely best solutions to such a problem.
I appreciate that. You know, I was overseas a number of years ago before the COVID outbreak, and there was a lot of discussion on the CFIUS rules and getting the EU and other partners to align some of their rules with that. And I think we're going to have to go through the same kind of process with respect to this this regime, once we get a better sense of what we want to do and what those rules should be. I appreciate all of your agreement that is an essential piece of any successful mechanism. Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman Howland. Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized from his office.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. I think it's critically important, and getting this right is a challenge. I'm going to talk for a minute or two before I ask questions about the fact that this has been such a focus of the Intelligence Committee over the last 4 years. Matter of fact, there was always a disconnect between what I was hearing from business circles and what I was hearing from the intelligence community about the enormous challenges and threats posed by the PRC. And let me be clear that my beef is with the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping's leadership. It is not with the Chinese people or the Chinese diaspora here in America or anywhere else in the world. But we have to acknowledge that there is no such thing as an independent company in China at this point. Chinese law dictates that all these companies have to be first and foremost loyal to the Communist Party, not their shareholders. So starting in 2018, we've now had 21 separate classified roadshow briefings to alert industry sector by industry sector of this challenge. I think we've made progress, and I think even groups like private equity, which were reluctant to hear this story at first because they were making so much money in Chinese tech companies, are starting to get the message. The level of intellectual property theft, the level of China investing not just directly, but through subsidiaries. I'm going to come back to that in a moment with my question. But this technology competition, I think, is the challenge of our time. We've got to deal with Russia, obviously, and Ukraine, but the technology competition with the PRC going forward, we've never faced this kind of economic competitor. And I would say to my colleagues, and I know we have to get the CHIPS bill right, but without the CHIPS bill, there would not be another chip manufacturing plant built in America. You look at the last 15, 18 years, I think there's been over 120 chip fabs built around the world, only 17 of them built in America. And every country around the world has this kind of program. We can either complain about that, or we can get in the game in terms of competition. And I think what we're doing in chips, we're going to have to do in other technology domains in a very, very careful way. But I want to start my question with, Dr. Danzman, one of the things that you've talked about in your statement was the idea of we need to think about this issue in almost network terms. Because what we've seen is, particularly in terms of our challenges with China, not only intellectual property theft, not only kind of Chinese inbound investment in the form of venture firms and other entities, but increasingly we're seeing China mask these activities through investment in, for example, European subsidiaries. And you've talked about some of the leakage that takes place. And my fear is that, while there's some new entities out there trying to clearly identify the supply chain, because I've seen private enterprises that indicate you go second or third level suppliers. And even now, we've got firms that are relying upon China and Russia sources. Do we know enough about kind of the overall supply chain so that whether it's, inbound investing or outbound investing, we have a good idea of identifying who we ought to be monitoring and making sure that we are accurately assessing the threats on outbound investment?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm happy to talk longer afterwards because this could be a long question. I want to keep my answer short. So there are kind of two aspects that I think are important here in your question. One is about entity resolution, which is how do we know who actually owns or who controls the entity that's investing? I think that we do have good intelligence and good ability in the U.S. at least to track that entity resolution quite well. But sometimes that is not something that all of our partners and allies have access to. But on the kind of broader question of how do we know what's going on in the supply chain, one thing that we've learned is that not even companies oftentimes know what's happening throughout their supply chain. Normally, there's knowledge of first-tier suppliers, but going down into the second and third tier, so the suppliers to the suppliers and the suppliers to the suppliers to the suppliers, there's not a lot of understanding of how that whole system works.
And I think there are, and let me just quickly, because I want to make one last point. I'm not going to get another question in, but there are private sector entities. There's a company in Virginia called Interos that tracks some of this. I think we need to have more of those sources. I don't have time for a question, but I will point out, Mr. Chairman, that we ought to not only look at outbound investment, but I do think we need to call into question. For example, Apple is a great American company. The idea that they're buying, potentially buying lots of their semiconductor chips from YMTC, frankly strengthens China's position in that market, and it's something that I know Senator Rubio and I and the Intel Committee have raised questions, and I think we need to look at that issue as well. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Warner. Senator Toomey and I would like to do a second round. It will take no more than 10 minutes, probably less, and we're also called to a vote at 11:30. I have a question together for Mr. Feddo and Mr. Ashooh. You both have experience working in positions that review the national security risks associated with certain business transactions. I'll start, Mr. Ashooh, with you. Based on your government experience, if policymakers established a notification requirement, what information would be helpful to collect?
Well, the most important information would be whether or not whatever they are engaged in intersects with our export restrictions. That currently exists right now under CFIUS, thanks to FIRMA. Mandatory declarations are required where there's critical technology that requires a license involved. I think, again, building on what works, that's a place I would start.
Okay. And Mr. Feddo, same question. What information would be helpful to collect in your mind?
I agree with Mr. Ashooh. I also think this is a place where relying on the IC and the FBI to identify certain sectors of greatest risk with respect to this outbound investment question, and have that inform where we're asking for reporting, because in some cases there may not be export controls, but it's a cutting edge technology that we need to know more about.
Thank you, Mr. Feddo. Senator Toomey.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So, I remain concerned about how well defined the problem we're trying to address actually is. I think I've heard that maybe it's really the gap between what we're able to limit now and what we might wish to might just be cash. I think we've heard a discussion about how there are these processes and know-how, which seems extremely difficult to define. Let me ask this, and I think I've just put this to each of our panelists. If we do go down the road of standing up an outbound screening notification regime, how important do you think it is that we limit the application to very precise and well-defined boundaries, and maybe even the importance that these boundaries be a reference to existing law that recognizes, that has already identified technologies that we're concerned about? We've got very limited time. I apologize for that, but maybe we could start with Mr. Strayer and work our way down.
Yes, Senator. We very much agree that we need to be very precise about how we're identifying those technologies. But the other thing that I've heard multiple times suggested is that just because something's on the Commerce Control List, that should immediately be something that's sought to be controlled in the investment level. But one needs to understand that the Commerce Department's Export Control List is very specific. So if there's an AI technology in its specific application added somewhere to the Commerce Control List, that should not prohibit investment in all artificial intelligence. So that translation is going to be very hard. It needs to be precise for reasons I outlined in my testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Feddo.
I agree. Precision is imperative if we move forward with this. Compliance costs for the private sector, even entities that aren't necessarily directly impacted by this will have compliance costs, and we'll need to consult with advisors and lawyers and others to make sure that they're on the right side of the law. So specificity is imperative.
Thank you.
Yeah, fully agree. In fact, I would say the power of our existing export control system, and it is powerful, is in its specificity, because it allows commerce to flow freely where we aren't doing the restricting.
Thank you. Professor?
I'll just agree. I think it's really important to have clarity for the certainty that it will provide to firms about what it is that they need to be worried about when they're thinking about outbound investment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Thanks to the witnesses. Thanks to the four of you today for your thoughtful, helpful testimony. Senators wishing to submit questions for the record, they're due 1 week from today, Tuesday, October 6th. And we ask you as witnesses to please submit the responses to those questions for the record within 45 days from the day you receive them. Thank you again for joining us. Committee's adjourned. Thank you.